Hello everyone, Mr. Jackson here, and today I'm going to be taking you through Unit 1, Lesson 1, which is going to be our Introduction to Global Systems. So let's get right into it. Today we're going to have 4 learning objectives, things that by the end of this presentation you should be able to do. The first one is we want to be able to explain why ecology is important, the study of ecology. We want to describe the methods used to study ecology. There are 3 of which we will know. We're going to explain how biotic and abiotic factors influence an ecosystem. And we're going to explain how we can understand global systems and the changes they undergo. There are going to be 10 new vocabulary terms for this first lesson that are going to be important for you to know. I will not be going through the definition and the term, but I will go ahead and, as we go through it, correctly pronounce the terms so that you understand how to say them. We will have biosphere, ecology, species, population, and community, ecosystem, biotic factor, abiotic factor, atmosphere, hydrosphere, and geosphere. So, ecology. What is it? All forms of life are going to be interacting with each other and with their environments all the time. And so ecology is going to be the term that we use for that scientific study of interactions among organisms and between organisms and their physical environment, right? So there's 2 parts to that. The interactions between organisms and then the organism and the environment and vice versa. We need to understand ecology so that we can design human economies that can be sustainable or account for our environments around us and the organisms we share the planet with. But also we need to be able to design economies to be resilient. So whenever there might be changes in our environment, we want to make sure that our society or our economies are able to adapt or adjust to still coexist with those changes. Now this is something that we are going to be bringing up a lot, not just in ecology, but in biology in general. We have levels of organization, and then more specifically here, levels of ecological organization that are going to be relevant to this unit. Ecologists study organisms and their environments on several different levels, so we can go all the way from a single organism or a single species, and then we would go to the next level where you would combine those organisms of the same species into a population. You take different populations to form communities. Different communities come together to form an entire ecosystem. And if you take ecosystems, they would form a biome. If you take all of the ecosystems that are similar. And then if you take all of the biomes that exist on our planet, that is what gives you our planet itself. And another term we can use for that is the biosphere. So I want to break down each one of these levels of organization. These represent essential vocabulary for this unit, so we want to make sure that we understand what they mean. Our first level, the smallest level or the least inclusive, is that of a species or an individual organism. This is just going to be a group of similar organisms that can breed and produce fertile offspring. That's what makes a species a species. So our first level is just going to be an individual organism. So that could be just that one wildebeest in the picture that you see there on the left. Now, if I take 2 or more organisms of the same species and they're all living in the same area, then at that point I can call that group a population. So whereas I went from one wildebeest of a species or one organism, now if I combine those organisms of the same species living in the same place, I can now have a population of wildebeests. And so I would take that population, again, same species in the same area, and if I were to take all of the different populations, so like, for example, not just the wildebeests, but also water buffalo and zebras and any other species that are living together in a defined area, we call that collection of different species all living together a community. So at the community level, we start to include different species of organisms. And then we would go to the next level, which would be that of the ecosystem. So whenever we go to the ecosystem, we now are going to include all the organisms that live in a place, some defined area. So all of the living organisms that are in that area, together with all of the non-living environment. So this is where we might start to include the terrain, the climate of the area. So we're not just talking about that is living, that would end at community. Now we're talking about also the non-living environment as well, and that is together what we call an ecosystem. And ecosystems are going to typically have very similar climates, very similar types of organisms. And if you were to look at a group of ecosystems that all share those similar climates, similar types of organisms, similar ways of living, well, then at that point you would have what we call a biome, right? It's a group of similar ecosystems. And a good example of this would be if I were to talk to you about the desert biome. Now, there's not just one desert on planet Earth, right? There are many desert ecosystems. And whenever I say desert, you probably have some idea of what I'm talking about. There are some factors, some types of climates, some types of organisms that typically live in deserts that come to mind. You might think of deserts as being a lot of sun, very little rain, usually very hot and dry. You would think that organisms who do well in the desert probably are going to be nocturnal or really good at conserving water. And so that desert biome is basically referring to a general characteristic or set of characteristics for all deserts. And finally, if you take all of those different biomes, right? So you might have deserts and tropical rainforests and tundras. If you take all of those different biomes, all those different types of ecosystems with similar climates and similar organisms, if you compare or combine all of those together, then at that point you would have that fully encompassed biosphere, which is just the part of the earth in which life exists. So land, water, air, all of the organisms that live on planet Earth are collectively referred to as the biosphere. And so in addition to ecology, we have ways in which we can study ecology. And so ecologists generally rely on three main approaches for conducting ecological work. And all of these would be part of the scientific method. We use observation, experimentation, and modeling, meaning that we're going to observe the world around us, we're going to ask questions, and we're going to want to set up experiments to test our observations and our hypotheses for why we think things exist or occur. And then whenever we have completed our experiments, we can create models to represent our findings. Models can be things like mathematical formulas or depictions of certain scientific phenomena. Many studies that we will do are going to involve all three of those approaches. They often do include all three, with ecologists usually using tools ranging from, it could be DNA analysis or even data that we gather from satellite imaging. So now we want to get into biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic factors are the living things that affect one another and are therefore part of each other's environment. Okay, so we're talking about living things within our ecosystems. So a biotic factor is any living part of the environment with which an organism might interact. So, for example, if we're looking at our heron here in the image on the right, biotic factors that would be important to the heron are going to be maybe the fish that it eats. Its food sources could be the predators that eat the herons, and then other species that would compete with the heron for food or for space within that environment. And we also have the physical factors also affecting organisms. So an abiotic factor, I apologize for the heading at the top here. I'll make sure that I change that before posting the slides. It should say abiotic factor. But an abiotic factor is any non-living part of the environment. So this could be sunlight, heat, precipitation, the humidity, the wind, soil, any of those physical characteristics, those physical features of an environment that aren't considered alive but are still going to define what the space is and how organisms live. Different examples that would also affect the heron would be water availability or water quality, perhaps temperature or the humidity in that environment. So those non-living features of an environment are what we call abiotic. And we can look at those together here where we have the living factors on the left and we have the non-living factors on the right. They come together in the middle to create the full environment. And then finally, we're going to get into modeling our global systems. So modeling our global systems, this is basically we need to be able to show systems that are in place, ways that we come to understand the world, the processes that operate within the systems that we look at, and the ways that those systems and processes interact with each other. And so to simplify that, right, because that might not give you much to latch onto, we can basically break down 4 global systems that are constantly interacting here on Earth. And those include, you can see up in the top left here, so those include the atmosphere. That's referring to that thin layer of gases that surround Earth. You can also think of it just as air. We have the biosphere, which we've already covered. That's, remember, just all living organisms and the environments they live in. We have the geosphere, which is referring to all the rock at and below Earth's surface. So those are those hard surfaces that define a lot of the terrain and are just the solid composition of our planet. And then finally you have the hydrosphere, which is all the water both above and below Earth's surfaces. So this can include the saltwater oceans, the freshwater bodies of water like lakes and streams, could include the let's say icebergs like frozen or ice above surface, or it could also include vapor. So any of the water both above and below Earth's surface is what we're talking about there. And the final thing I want to draw your attention to is not just that these 4 different systems are noted and how they're always interacting, but also there are 3 different, I guess, sort of categories through which we can look at these 4 systems. We can look at each of the 4 in terms of the measurable changes in the Earth system. A good example of this is looking at patterns of climate change. We can look at how each of those Earth systems work. So if we were to actually look within each of these categories and study the life that exists in each of those categories, that would also be a way that we can use this model. And then within that, we can also look at causes of global change. So there's some interaction at work here that you take the measurable changes, how the systems work, and if you understand those, then you can start to understand why global change that includes all of them, why that's occurring as well. So again, we had 4 lesson objectives. to start this. We wanted to understand the importance of ecology, how ecologists actually study ecology. We wanted to understand the difference between biotic and abiotic factors, those biotic being living and abiotic being non-living. And then we also wanted to understand how global systems can be used to develop models that are useful. So that is the conclusion of lesson 1, and I hope that this was helpful.